Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack.
And I'm Rachel.
And for those of you who want to watch the video of this, just a reminder, you can go to our YouTube channel, which is Healing Paths. I think it's just Healing Paths, not Healing Paths Recovery. That's our website. But you can go to YouTube and check that out on our YouTube channel. Then you'll see the video of Rachel and I. You can also hear the audio on most of your podcast apps. And just a reminder to hit subscribe, like, share. That would be greatly appreciated. So today, Rachel and I are going to be talking about ownership and partnership. Or ownership, let's say, versus partnership, not and, because I don't think you can do both.
Yeah.
So we both agree we need to start with a little bit of history. So let's go back. Where would you say we need to go back to?
I mean, I don't know. When I did my presentation, I went way back.
Yeah, you did. Yeah. I mean, we can go back to the 1700s, though.
Yeah. I mean, like, the reality is, up until a certain point, really up until the 1700s, women were seen as complete property of their fathers to be bargained with in
for the
marriage.
benefit of the family.
For the benefit of the family.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so the sons inherited, the women became a type of currency, right? Like, and that's where dowries come from. That's where that idea of like marriage gifts come from. And so really up until the 1700s, when Queen Victoria took the throne, we have that history. And there's a lot mixed into that that I won't go into, but like, we have, like, it wasn't unheard of or unfounded for men to like beat their wives as they would their cattle or their horses into submission. Women were seen like wives were seen as higher than slaves, but still property of the master.
Well, and also wives were seen as creating or reproduction, ability, like making children so that the husband had heirs or had daughters that would, bring in dowries, bring in money. So she was also seen as her and the children she would produce were seen as part of building his empire.
Yes. And I mean, like on a big scale, we see that in like dynasties in which like the whole like Mary and Anne Boleyn and I can't remember what his last wife was in Henry VIII, like all of that was about succession and about like what they could provide the king, and was bloody and messy and created succession wars after, right? Because all he had was daughters. But there's like, we watch that happen in grand scale. Like if that is the person who runs the, world, or at least England at the time and the English kingdoms at the time, we were watching that, right? And in Catholic owned countries, right, it was the Pope and then whoever was ruling the country, and all of the women that were attached to that were still bartering chips, right? Like oftentimes the church would set up alliances and marriages based on family ties and would deny rights to family ties and marriages based on like how much strength that would give an individual family or an individual royalty over the church. And so there was a lot of like political stuff very high up. But that did trickle down into your like average human being, right? Like there were laws around males and property. If you have watched Bridgerton, which is in the Regency period, which is like the late 1700s, no, Regency period would be after the Civil War. So late 1800s. That period, that's still happening, in which like a woman's virtue, a woman, like all of that is still required to get a good match, right? Like it's all about
Right,
getting
right.
the good match, which
Not for the sake of a healthy marriage, which is what we're looking at today, but in terms of, financial success, benefiting the family, status, power.
Right. And you see this kind of showing up in pop culture, like throughout the years. Like My Fair Lady is a perfect example of it. That's fairly modern. It was made in the 1950s. And right, like they're still talking about the difference in like male relationships and female relationships. And Dr. Higgins prefers male relationships because they're more intellectual, and he feels like, right, and he just considers like women dumb and emotional, and he doesn't put them on the same level as him. Even after, so like that's in the 1950s, and was considered like normal enough that it didn't start an outrage, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about the social tone in that way, but there were also laws that were passed along the way that kind of gave women more freedom.
But before we get into that, because that's, I would say in America, when America started, we had our early colonies.
Mm-hmm.
They adopted a similar organization as the British.
Yeah.
In that women had no rights to own property. They didn't have a right to vote. They didn't have any rights in England, and the American colonies adopted the same.
Right.
Which, we can say some great things about our founding fathers, and some of those things are true, but they also had their own biases and their limits and their thinking.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Like if you've watched Hamilton, right, there's a whole song about women being completely cut out of the narrative, the story.
Yeah.
And actually that was one of the things that happened in the Revolutionary War that we don't really talk about a lot, is how a lot of the British got strongholds in certain towns and were able to set up militia, were able to set up in certain towns, is they would come in and kill the men, and then the women wouldn't be able to hold or own their property, and so it would fall back to the state, which means it would be taken over by the British soldiers, which again, if you can't own property,
right,
this home that you
built, you can't keep earnings that property may produce. Yeah.
All of it went to the state, right? And so that's how they were able to set up strongholds in certain, in Massachusetts and things like that. And I think it's really important for us to recognize how much, when a woman married, even taking on the last name of her husband, right? She usually let go of her maiden name, and took on the name of her husband. That was denoting that she had no property. She had no identity outside of him.
Right.
Which
is ownership. What we're talking about.
Right.
That meant that she was now her husband's property and had his name.
And in most religious and government communities, by the time a boy was 8, he was no longer considered, he was considered higher than his mother, in terms of if dad died at 8, you could manage property that your mother was then
beholden to.
Yeah.
So moving through the timeline, let's jump into, I think, the 1800s.
Yeah. So in the 1860s, in 1850, they passed a law, kind of unilaterally, that wife beating was illegal. And then 14 years later, they did a ratification saying that you couldn't be criminally prosecuted for that unless the beating ended in permanent maiming or injury. So unless you were crippled or burned or something like that, just if the bruises would heal and the bones would mend on their own, it wasn't considered wife beating. So we have a 14-year gap there where that wasn't true. And then they decided, we have too many people taking up our court system,
Right.
mistreating their wives, we need to like call this. And instead of, you know, making people better humans, we just said like, okay, if it didn't, like if she didn't lose the loss of a body part, then that eventually gets ratified in the 1920s, I think is where like that comes from. But like that's like the rule of thumb comes from like beating your wife with a rod that's no bigger than your thumb won't leave permanent marks or scars, right? Which is awful, and I think that we should probably remove that saying from our list of things that we talk about. But that is where that comes from, is like, okay, well, if you use a rod the width of your thumb or less, you're less likely to create permanent damage. And so that's where that kind of came from. In 1924, the first.
First, let's back up. So in 1866, we get the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
So that's after the Civil War. 14th Amendment is passed by Congress, giving citizens and voters, which were defined as males.
Yes.
And particularly black males, because prior to that, males already had the right? But giving them, like defining citizens and having rights as male in the Constitution.
Yes.
So they're looking at, when it's referring to, people, kind of this broad language, they go ahead and they determine in the 14th Amendment that specifically related to males.
Yes. So like none of those laws that were passed included women, children, especially not women and children of color.
Right.
And I think that is a good distinction. And honestly, that the 14th Amendment passing is how we got some of the women's laws, because it was very racially charged.
Right.
Unfortunately, like most of women progressing in the late 1800s and early 1900s was more about white males being able to hold onto their property longer, and would rather have their wives hold on to it than a black man. And so they, then start passing the right for women to hold their own land,
right,
under their name, or like being able to keep their own wages, which the keep their own wages thing was a state by state thing. California did that earlier than like we did as a nation. But it did happen in the 20s, in which like women could
early
keep their
1900s, where women could keep wages that they themselves earned
and property that they owned.
Right.
And so like before this, when a woman entered into a marriage, any property that she owned then became the property of her husband. That was no longer required by the 1920s. Women could hold their own property and keep their own income, which is really important. Like we often think about this in terms of like the wealthy, but the reality is like this helped the average woman way more than it helped anybody else, because previously to this, women always worked, right? Like they always worked in factories. The Industrial Revolution was huge for women. And
prior to that, they were working on farms.
Right.
Like they're part of, keeping the family farm going,
right,
bringing in money, bringing in food that way.
Right. So like it was a lot of free labor.
Right.
It was a free labor force. But when women were able to start holding onto their own money, then like, and oftentimes people don't realize this, but in any culture in which you allow women to hold their own money, we actually watch the economy get better, because women will spend their money to better their family and their children and their education systems. And what we saw, especially in the early 1900s, is that women were holding on to money and saving and investing in things.
Right.
Where a lot of like lower class and middle class men would just spend their money, right? Like whatever money we have, like it was a very selfish kind of thing. And I'm not saying that everybody did that, but as a whole, that was a national consensus. And for homes in which there was a lot of alcohol use or abuse or like drug use, women then had the ability to like stash money so that they could feed their family when husband went on a bender. And like there were a lot of economic leaps that women made during that time because they could hold on to their own money.
Right. And just to clarify, so that law is passed in the 1800s. early 1900s, sorry.
Early 1900s.
Early 1900s. But that's not maybe considered logical thinking. And so later, like in the 1900s, in 1970s, we have to have additional laws giving women that ability to, like own their own bank account without a male signature. Women could have their own bank account prior to that. So again, we have some maybe progressive thinking, although, like you were saying, the thinking is also based on keeping land in the family, keeping land for, those people, not necessarily giving it to the state, who then could give that land to people coming out of slavery, the Black people coming out of slavery, other situations like that.
Yeah.
So,
right. So like it really was this, it's convoluted, right?
Yes.
Like it's like 2 steps forward, 4 steps back.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is why it's not, we jump ahead to the 1970s and we have to fight that battle again in a different way, because the thinking wasn't necessarily, of course we should give women rights.
Right.
Of course we should make life more livable, the pursuit of happiness better for them. That's not the thinking.
Right.
Which those laws come out of. And so again, when the, social structure changes, when we have, like, we're not hoarding cash or, types of money that way, and it's more going through banks and we're using checks, different things like that, we have to also pass laws about that, because it's not that the thinking was necessarily progressive.
Right. And it's really confusing when you actually look at the laws and like why they passed some the way they did, and like why, why some things were allowed but other things weren't. And it comes down to like, it was what was benefiting the people able to vote at the time,
which were white men. Yeah.
And like, especially
because even, let's just back up and acknowledge this, even when the 14th Amendment was passed, giving Black men the right to vote, there was still a lot of ways that white men tried to interfere with their ability to vote, whether that was, them hanging out at the voting stations and threatening Black people, making it unsafe for them to go to the polls, requiring, having like driver's license and different things like that, requirements to vote became a thing. Again, to disenfranchise.
There were some like you had to be able to like read at a certain point,
right,
and like,
sign your name,
which most Black men could not do because they weren't allowed to do that as slaves. And so like there were definitely some leaps there that like happened. And I think that this is a great, like, as we're talking about this, the difference between ownership and partnership, I think that this is a great conversation as a whole to human existence, period. Because in general, the Anglo-Saxon European culture has always owned slaves of some kind. They have always owned people. It's always been a hierarchical system in which like someone gets owned somewhere. And that goes way back, right? And so like
it goes back to the beginning of patriarchy, because prior to that, those individuals were hunter-gatherers.
Right.
They did not need a lot of people to take care of what they owned, because they were, collecting, gathering what they needed for so many months, and then they would move on.
Right.
So having this hoard of stuff was not helpful to them, because it made the moving more difficult.
Right.
And so until we had the agricultural revolution, when people stayed in one place and they could start to gather things and own things and build them up, then they needed more people to help in that labor, to help with the protection. All of that type of stuff started to change. And that was with also the institution of patriarchy, which created the hierarchical structures, gave power to most likely the men who had the most or could amass the most.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there was a lot of brutality in that over women. There was a lot of, I think they called it bride stealing. Was that what they called it? they called it bride stealing, where, they would take a woman, childbearing age, from another tribe, and like they would basically kidnap her and make her part of theirs so that they could, have access to reproduction in order to build their dynasty, to build their their power systems.
Right. So like this is not something that was just like invented overnight. Like this is something that's like been in the ethos for millennia. And I kind of want to make that point for the simple reason that like it gets real convoluted when you get down to it, right? Like if you were to like step in a time machine and go back in the time, like most women also accepted this as this is just life.
Right.
There were women that fought against that.
But and there were women who tried to create their own hierarchical structures.
Yes. But right, like the idea that like we could break the system and make something different was really, really hard to fathom. And so these like small strides forward often had like back doors and things like that, because like no one really could imagine a world different. And I think that that's really, really important to recognize. And
it's also this model of thinking that, there's some scarcity involved, like there's not enough to go around. If we give access to half our population, which is female, if we give access to finances, to education, to empowering their social status, then this other half is going to be hurt by that. And so having this system of belief that somebody has to be oppressed in this system for other people to be successful was also part of the thinking.
Yeah, for sure.
Which then leads to some of that thought process of ownership versus partnership. Like that's a hard model to introduce partnership in, because in partnership, again, I give my wife rights and then she's going to divorce me, then she's going to leave me. No, we're not going to give her that option.
Right. And so, right, like there was too much risk there.
Yeah.
And some of that comes from you can see that in, if you ever read stuff around like Manifest Destiny, or even Darwin's like social evolution, and how he believed like people evolve socially, right? Like he really believed that we were apex predators and that most of the things that we did were predatory, which is fascinating, right? When you start to think about how we treat other humans. And that was kind of the point. But yeah, so then
let's get to the suffragette movement.
Yeah.
So Susan B. Anthony cast her first vote to test the 14th Amendment. I mean, she knew full well that it was giving Black males the right to vote, but she decided, let's stir the pot, and she cast her first vote, thinking that her action would be interpreted broadly to start generating women this idea, like you were saying, this idea that maybe the structure could be different and women have the right to vote and have a say in how systems are and what the laws are.
Yeah.
She was convicted.
Yeah, she was
and charged. She was charged and convicted. So, but it did start a movement.
Yeah, it did. And I mean, like, we love Susan B. Anthony.
Right.
But I mean, that was very brave, right? Like she knew going into that. And it's really interesting when you look at the suffragette history, there's a lot out there that is fascinating because it parallels. So the American suffragette movement parallels the British suffragette movement. And there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of differences, but it's also really, really amazing to me that these, because it was both strands were started by educated women who realized
of means. I mean, they
most of them were wealthy.
Their own means, but their spouse did.
Yeah, like they came from wealthy families. Most of them came from wealthy families, right? But then they realized this is not what we want, and this is and many times if you read the suffragette things, it's the realization that they didn't want that for their daughters. Like that was the defining factor for them. But it quickly spread into industry, right? Like it quickly spread into factory work settings and things like that, where women were getting paid minuscule based
Right.
on males, and like trying, and most of those women were like struggling to survive and dealing with like affairs weren't really considered an issue for men to have them, but women
Could not.
could not. And so they were dealing with a lot of those kinds of things, right? Also because, and this is really scary, but like because children were seen as the father's property, women asking for more meant and that the men could keep the children from their mothers, and that women could be could be cut off from their children, which has been a tactic historically. Like if you want to get women to submit, you go after their children.
Right.
And that happened in the suffragette movement quite a bit, actually, in which like the state would remove children from homes because women were protesting, and they were seen as dangerous. Like there was a lot of that happened. And when we look at the fact that these women were like, it mattered enough that they didn't stop.
Right.
I think is incredible. And we got some pretty good movement from that. Now we also have some like issues in which it happened more in Britain than it did in America, but like in Britain, the suffragette movement got really violent and it got pretty hostile. And there's a movie called The Suffragettes, in which, and I can't remember the name of the lady that they follow in that movie, but she's famously quoted for this. So she's taken before Parliament, and one of the lords, House of Lords, is like, why did it have to go violent? Like, why couldn't your voice be heard? And she goes, because violence is the only voice that men listen to. We've been trying for 100 years. We have talked to you as husbands. We have talked to you as, as equals. We have tried, and you will not listen. So you listen to violence, which I think is one of the, just like one of the most incredible, like, moments in history is like the recognition that women have been saying this at tables with their spouses for at least
probably with their fathers,
right,
with their spouses, with their brothers,
and they just weren't listened to. And it took them saying like, yes, like we're ready, we're willing to take on a felony for this. We're willing to go to prison for this. Yes, we're willing to lose our jobs for this. Yes, we're willing to lose our kids for this, so that our kids have a future.
Right.
And so then we have that happen.
So in 1890,
yeah,
Wyoming was the first state that granted women the right to vote in elections. And then I think states pretty quickly followed.
Yeah. I mean, like it was within a like 10-year decade time span in which like the states ratified that or pushed it through, because I think at some point they realized like we're going to lose this.
Right.
And especially in the southern states, and I think Utah was one of the first states to push it through. It was pretty fast.
Although, I mean, in Utah, they were still practicing polygamy.
Right.
So men saw giving the right to women to vote meant that men had more than one vote, because they still decided that, I mean, or in their viewpoint, their wives had to vote the way that they wanted them to vote.
Right.
And so instead it just looked like, oh, I get 10 votes now, or I get 5 votes instead of 1 vote. So that had a lot to do with the motivation behind Utah quickly giving women the right to vote.
I mean, I think that was true in most of the steps that most of the states that moved really quickly, is not necessarily the polygamy aspect, but the fact that they were losing ground politically to people that opposed them, and having their wives vote the same way as them gave them basically double the numbers.
Right.
And so like, again, messy. And I also don't want to take away from all of the well-intentioned men who were behind pushing those through too, because there were some very, very strong, like allied men who helped to push through, and it had to be men, because they were
it's always had to be part of the majority class helping the minority class to move forward with rights.
yeah, and so then we move, and then we have like a lapse in things for a while.
So by
And-
1900, every state had passed legislation granting married women, again, married women, the right to keep their own wages and to own their own property in their name.
Yes. By the 1920s, women could earn and own their own property whether or not they were married, but they would still have to have a man sign for it, usually their father, right? But
and in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified that ensured the right of all women to vote.
Yes. And so then we have kind of a lapse of time between the 1920s. The Depression hits. There's not a lot of movement that happens for women's rights, or like people are just trying to survive.
Right.
And there's a lot of ways in which, like,
I mean, in 1923, the first version of the ERA
yes,
was introduced.
yes,
It just stated men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place to its jurisdiction. So that's basically the language that was introduced, just that men and women have equal rights. That was in 1923 that was introduced.
yeah. It didn't pass.
Mm-hmm.
It has never passed. An ERA has never passed in the United States, nationally.
Right.
And so
it came close in the 70s.
It did.
But it did not pass.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so then we have like the Depression, and we have World War II, in which women got, cool thing about World War II. So we had this like women's right to own property, women's right to earn wages, things like that. We also had a lot of single women go into the workforce during World War II that had never happened before, right? Like we had a lot of women going into jobs that like would have been held for men, that we just didn't have men to fill. So we put women in those places, and women started to realize they could earn a lot more money in freedom than they could in seamstress factories and things like that. And they started to realize, I think that there was a level in which, like, up until that point, women had a belief or a bar that like certain things women just can't do, right? Like welding, or right, like that was just kind of generally
or sports.
Right, like the female body was just too weak to do that. And then you get these women who are like having to use sledgehammers every day, and welding gear and building planes and tanks and missiles, and they're building muscle, and they're starting to realize like, oh, I can do things. Like this is not a like biological problem. Like, and I get that there is a biological difference between men and women, but it wasn't as drastic as we had made it up until that point.
Well, I think when trains became a thing and transportation via trains became a thing, it was thought that women could not travel by train because their bodies, if they moved at that rate of speed, their uteruses would
detach
or
something, like
be left behind, basically. Which is crazy thinking.
Yeah, I know. We didn't understand the female anatomy.
So but it's this whole like, again, I mean, this thought process that, I mean, yes, men don't have uteruses, but like, I think that's why it was specified to the uterus. It couldn't be their kidneys. It couldn't be their liver, because both sets of genders had both of those. And so it had to be something that women had that men didn't, that the speed of the train, which again is not that fast compared to how fast we can travel today, but that would somehow cause bodily injury to the reproductive system of women.
But yeah, so like, and I hate to say this, but like, there is a level in which like women realize that like, and to be clear, like most lower and middle class women knew this. You can work through bleeding. Women have known that for a long time, but I think in terms of like factory paid jobs, it became realized that like, oh, women don't have to take a week off every month.
Well, I mean, they didn't when they were farming.
They didn't.
They didn't when they were doing all these other things.
But we kind of use that as an excuse, right? And so, but like, so they got really good at these skills in World War II. And then World War II ended. And we needed jobs for the men coming home. And so there was this huge propaganda campaign, like Norman Rockwell paintings are kind of known for this, but it was a huge campaign to get women back in the home and back to having babies for
And that
multiple
was
reasons.
And that was when we started this concept of a single income household where
Yes.
men went to work and women stayed home.
Yes. It was also when we defined what being middle class looked like, right?
Mhm.
When it meant like living in the suburbs, white picket fence, stay at home mom, 2 kids, right? It was, and literally all of that was very much a propaganda push by advertisement agencies and the government to get our economy back to normal. And
there were also a lot of entitlements for the men who had served in World War II
right.
that made it possible for them to live on a single income
Right.
and have nice things like have a vacation, own a house, have an automobile. There were a lot of government entitlements issued that allowed for that to happen.
Yeah. And the reality is like there's a level of that that's probably well deserved after everything that they experienced. And this is one part in which our like government took accountability and ownership of like, yes, you've been through hard things and we're going to reward that in a big way. And there were some big like I would hate to call it socialist movements because people get up in arms about that, but there were some pretty big like socialist movement activities that happened during that time to like create better education systems and better libraries and allow people to buy a house without large debt. And right. And so there were just things like that happened. Right. The automobile became more common.
In the UK, that's when socialized medicine was passed.
Right.
After World War II, when so many people had been injured and their ability to work was somewhat diminished. And there were just a lot of health issues after going through World War II that, as a nation, they passed universal health care at that point.
Right.
We did not.
Right. But they did get the VA.
Yeah.
Which was, right, like soldiers did get access to the VA and the VA was then funded. And like there's some pieces of that. So like soldiers actually got socialized medicine in a way, right? Like, and so, right, but there was this big social push in there. And then we get to the 70s in which there becomes this big push for women to be able to own the bank accounts.
Right. So prior to that, in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed by Congress that promised equitable wages for the same work, regardless of race, color, or this national origin or sex of the worker. That hasn't ever really been enforced. And so we still see pay inequalities amongst the genders today. I think that's Utah historically comes up as one of the biggest states for pay inequity.
And then that disperses down like racially too, right? So we get that passed, and then in the 70s we get the right to own a bank account without a man signing for it.
Right. So also in the 60s, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act passed legislation prohibiting sexual discrimination in employment, meaning like prior to that, if a woman got married, she could be fired. She could not be hired for a job because it was assumed that she would then be a stay-at-home mom and have kids. Also, I think it was later that legislation was passed that you couldn't fire a woman who was currently pregnant. But in 1964, that was passed. And in 1965, the Supreme Court established the right of married couples to use contraception, which it's crazy to me that we have a Supreme Court legislating that. And that was also a right that gave women the ability to control when they became pregnant.
Yeah.
And how many kids they had and how often they were pregnant.
Yeah. And it's really interesting too. Like you can see this culturally. I grew up on country music, so like I was a big like Loretta Lynn fan and things like that. And you can see like where like those songs start to hit the mainstream media, and like what that meant to women, right? Like if you just listen to the lyrics of The Pill, that is one of the most still one of the most profound songs I think to ever play on the radio, because you are hearing a woman say, like, this is what it means for me.
Right.
And yeah, and so like, so that happens. Women get the right to own their own bank accounts without a man signing. And
well, and in 1969, California passed the first no-fault divorce
yes,
laws, which, I mean, today pretty much all 50 states, I believe, have no-fault divorce, which also was pivotal in, I think, making it safer for women to leave marriages that were unhealthy. It made it, I mean, it's still often, if women left a toxic marriage, you know, later we get the right for, I mean, back hundreds of years ago, right? The children were seen as property of the man. And so if a woman fled, she couldn't take her children. Those were his property. So, you know, at this point, we start to see women given custody of the kids, but again, still making it very difficult for women to make the income that she would have made had she been married.
Right.
I mean, she wasn't making income then, but she had income that would help care for her and the kids. And so, you know, still for a while, it was women given custody of the kids, but making it very financially difficult for them to maintain themselves and their children.
Yeah. And I mean, no contest divorce didn't pass in all 50 states until the 80s.
Right.
And right now, right, there's 4 states currently trying to get rid of that. And so like,
yeah, we're seeing a lot of movement currently to try to roll back a lot of these rights that have been established.
Yeah. In 1993, the last state passed marital rape laws, saying that that could be a criminally charged offense, that you weren't entitled to sex because you were married, that the marriage license was not a unilateral consent. Utah's was 1991, so it was one of the last ones to pass that. Utah State's legislation now considers marital rape the same as it considers every other rape. So it's there's not a differentiation, which some states do have a differentiation and require like proof of like other domestic or emotional violence. Utah State does not, which I think is great. Like it's considered on the same level as other rapes, and you don't have to defend the relationship, because there are states that do require you to defend like that it is a historically violent relationship or things like that. But marital rape in 1993 could be prosecuted in all 50 states as criminal.
So also going back to the 1974 housing discrimination was passed. So they couldn't discriminate about a woman owning her own or renting her own place, owning a house. Also that, I think that was the same year that the legislation was passed, giving her the right to own her own bank account without a male signing. Prior to that, if she were to rent an apartment, she would have needed a male to sign also for that apartment. She couldn't have just signed for that on her own.
It was also around that time, and I don't have the dates because we didn't look this up before. But it was also around the same time that we started passing that women could like sign for their own property, sign for their own loans, sign for their own bank accounts. But
it was not until 1988 that a woman could get a business loan on her own without a male signature.
Yeah. But when we started passing those laws, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's somewhere in that like 10-year gap in the 70s and 80s, that HIPAA compliancy laws changed so that men in your family did not have access to your medical records. And I can't remember exactly when that changed, but that was massive, because up until that point, any father or husband could ask to see your medical records.
Right.
And like, so if you went into a hospital because you had been like, had a domestic violence thing, right? Your husband could come into the hospital the next day and demand to see those records.
And see what you reported.
And see what you reported. And so like, that was massive. Also, like if you were taking contraception without knowledge of your husband or father.
Right.
They could request those records and then make you stop. They had access to all of your mental health and therapy records. So, right, like Mad Men has an episode of this that I think is just like brilliantly exposes like what this looks like. So his wife is going to therapy because she's depressed and she's anxious. She's at home all the time with the kids, and they've put her on Valium, which they put all women on Valium at some point in this time period. But Don Draper is in a hotel room with another woman, and he calls the therapist and gets a rundown of like what his wife has said and like, you know, what that looks like. And the therapist is like, yeah, I mean, like, I know that she's just complaining because she's, you know, whatever, but like she's complaining that you're not home enough. Right. And it's just this like beautiful snapshot of like how insidious that was in relationships. If you could just call a doctor and be like, my wife is acting crazy today, give her something.
Right. Well, it was also the majority of therapists back then, doctors back then are male.
Yeah.
So it's a male going to another male to get information about his wife. Again, not a partnership model.
Right.
Like, just a reminder, we're talking about ownership versus partnership. There were so many things that needed to change in order to get to where we are now, where we can start talking about partnership models in marriages and relationships.
I mean, there was a lot of like superseding the female in every aspect of life, right? Like, if you didn't like what she was spending, you gave her an allowance. If you didn't like what she bought with that allowance, you could not give her money at all.
Right.
Like, all of that was up to like the male prerogative, which doesn't require conversations, right? And I think about our clients and like the hardest conversations that we have in a marriage, and the 3 top reasons that people get divorced in America right now is disagreement on finances, disagreement on sex, and disagreement on religion. And all 3 of these were controlled up until a certain point. Like, we didn't have to have conversations about these because there were laws that said that we didn't have to have conversations.
I think one of the other ones closely up with the number 3 is disagreement on parenting.
Yeah.
Which, again, that used to be pretty controlled because they were the property of the husband.
Right. That's number 4.
Yeah. Okay. So in 1974, the Supreme Court also ruled that it was illegal to force pregnant women to take maternity leave on the assumption that they were incapable of working in their condition. So this isn't post having a baby. This is while you are pregnant. That they could fire you because you just were not capable of working in that condition of being pregnant. So the Supreme Court ruled that was not okay. But again, it's this idea up until that ruling that the government, your employer, all these other people had more of an ability to determine what you were or were not capable of doing, more so than yourself. So then in 1975, the Supreme Court denied states the rights to exclude women from juries. And then in 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act banned employment discrimination against pregnant women in general. So
like, I kind of like, you and I talk about this a lot, right? Like, we've spent a lot of time talking about the history of this, and there's a lot of nuance in this. And I know that the nuance can get lost with us just throwing out dates and explaining this, but like, the reality is the history of marital partnership as a partnership has not actually existed until like the last 20, 25 years, right? Like, if marital rape was not criminal until 1993, we cannot have a conversation about consent until 1993 in marriages. And
which is the year I got married.
Which is like, that's the year that Hook came out, guys. Like,
with Robin Williams.
Like, so like, when we're talking about this, when we're looking at these like big things, and like, I think it's important for us to recognize that there are languages that we developed around this. There are mythos that we
Mhm.
developed around this. There's a culture that we developed around this that like we are having to unlearn
Right.
as a culture while simultaneously learning how to partner.
Right. You and I talked before we started recording about in 1981 how when Lady Diana Spencer was marrying King Charles, who's king now, but at the time Prince Charles, how she deleted the vow to obey from the
Mhm.
marriage vows, and that was scandalous. That was a really big deal that she took it upon herself to remove the vow to obey her husband.
Right.
Also good for her.
Right.
But yeah, that's in 1981, folks, that like somebody took that vow out of the marriage vow that she was supposed to make, and it caused a scandal.
Mhm.
She caused a lot of scandals, actually.
Yeah, she broke a lot of norms.
Yes.
We love her for that. But I do think that there is a level, right? Like we didn't love her. I mean, I think that people loved her for that, but there was a lot of pushback for that.
Yeah.
And I think that as Americans, we gave a lot of grace to her being a British princess, that women doing the same thing in our culture, we did not have a lot of grace for.
Exactly.
And like, and I have examples of that, but like, I think that that's like, we just aren't good at seeing how these things have colored how we view the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, when we start looking at like partnership, like I grew up in a religious culture that talks about the difference between like egalitarian and complementarian relationships. And really what we're talking about is partnership versus ownership. Complementarian relationships are hierarchical in the way that they are taught. I can get behind the idea that everyone is equal but different.
Sure.
I actually love that idea. I think that if we actually believed that that's what it was, it would be fine. But that's not how, like, complementarian relationships typically give men a trump card, right? Like if we can't come to an agreement, then the man decides. And that's not partnership, right? Like if you did that in a business in which like you had two business partners who don't agree with something and one business partner decides unilaterally,
right?
Like, that is not only bad for business, like that can land you outside of that partnership. And I think,
well, and particularly if it was two male business partners who both think that they're entitled to that final say. Because having been, like, when I first started this company, it was named something different. I had a business partnership with a male, and after I decided to leave the business partnership and it got ugly, and you were employed at that point, so you recall how ugly it got. After, when I'm looking through financial stuff and we're having to put everything on the table, that's when I became aware that he was making financial decisions that I was not aware of. And he felt no obligation to tell me, which caused some financial problems for the company that he wouldn't own, because I had no idea those decisions were even being made with the finances. So it wasn't me causing those problems. But yeah, I think, and again, he did not feel any right or that he had any obligation to tell me those things. Even though it was an equal partnership, he had no problem keeping that from me.
Right. And I mean, you call that a business divorce.
I do call it a business divorce, yes.
Right. Like, I think that there's a level of that.
The police had to get involved at one point.
Yeah. I mean, like, and I think that that's the point I'm making, right? Like,
yeah,
people can, I think this is the problem that I see most in marriages and that are struggling with this concept of partnership, right? Like that are struggling with like this concept of partnership versus ownership is like partnership requires a lot more talking. It requires a lot more agreement. It requires us to see each other's side a lot more, to be able to stand in each other's shoes.
Yeah, I'll often say partnership is not efficient.
Yeah.
Like sometimes we have to table a discussion for a day and then come back to it and retable it. before we've actually come to a final decision.
Right. I mean, I think a great example of this, very early in my marriage, we had a conversation with a pastor friend of ours. And like, the reality is, like, we have known this pastor for our entire marriage. And every once in a while, he would just like bring up the conversation of complementarian versus egalitarian because he did not understand how mine and my partner's relationship worked. And he was like, okay, but like if you're dying and he has to make a decision about a medical thing that you don't agree with, I was like, okay, first of all, if I'm dying, I'm probably not conscious.
Right.
Right. And if like, I'm probably not going to hold him accountable to a decision that I don't agree with if I'm not able to make it.
Uh-huh.
But if he knows what my decision is and he goes against it, yeah, that's going to be a problem later.
Right.
We're probably not going to make it through that discussion. And he was like, okay, that's a bad example. So like, what if like he got a really, really, really good job somewhere that you didn't want to move, and it came down between like you not wanting to move and him like advancing his career, and like who gets to make that decision? And I was like, well, we do. Like if we don't agree on the decision,
Uh-huh.
the default answer is that we don't agree and we're not moving forward.
Right. We have to talk about it.
We have to talk about it. And if if we can't come up with a good decision before we move forward, then like it wasn't the right decision for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that he just could not understand that. He was like, but what if that's the right decision for him? And I was like, it won't be. If he and I can't agree, it won't be the right decision for him.
Right.
And if it is the right decision for him and it's not the right decision for me, then we've got to talk about where the relationship goes.
Mm-hmm.
Because like that is right, like that's a non-negotiable split. But like the reality is, like, if the point is to keep the relationship together, then the relationship, we do what's best for the relationship, not what's best for one person over the other person, right? Like, and
which again goes to that idea, which I know is kind of it contradicts the idea in the Bible talking about husband and wife being one, which under that context, basically meaning the husband knows best and what he's doing is best for her.
Mm-hmm.
And so he could make unilateral decisions instead of understanding that like we have to come together and agree on something and be as one in making that decision, not one person making that decision above or against the other.
Right. And I know that we're out of time today and we spent a lot of time on history, but like part 2 of this, we can get more into like how this works in today's relationships and talking about like where ownership shows up and where partnership shows up in today. But like, I do feel like we had to kind of lay the framework of we're newbies at this partnership thing.
We don't have a lot of great models for this yet.
Yeah. We are learning as we go.
Right.
And there are ways that I've seen it work really well, and I've seen ways that it does not work really well. But I do think for us to have good marriages and good partnerships, we've got to get rid of this hierarchical model in our marriages. I mean,
and in our thinking,
right. I mean,
in a lot of ways that we approach a lot of things. I think we're at a pivotal point in our country for this, right? Where we're either moving more towards a partnership model or back towards an ownership model.
Yeah. And I think as individuals, we've got to start questioning, like, which one do we crave more? Because ownership has a lot of power for the people who own,
right?
But it's also very lonely, and it's very isolating, and it's and it's exhausting. That's a lot of weight for you to carry by yourself, right? Like if you could have someone else helping carry the weight for you, like why wouldn't you want that?
Right.
So, yeah.
So more to come in part 2.
Part 2.
This one is kind of laying the groundwork, getting into the nuances and the history, and then we'll talk more about what does partnership take? What does that look like? What has to change thinking-wise, behavior-wise, to really move us more into a partnership model?
Yeah.
Okay, so until next time, at the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.